Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to episode 26. This week we're going to talk about international trade. And international trade is a topic that actually relates very closely to what we did at the very beginning of this semester. Specifically, when we talk about trade, the question is why would we trade with other nations? Why would we trade with other countries? And the moral of the story is it basically comes down to opportunity cost differences. The story is that one nation should specialize where they have the relatively lowest opportunity cost and produce that items or those items, and let other nations specialize where they have the relatively lowest opportunity cost. And then those nations trade with each other. Each of them can potentially have a bigger pie, more goods and services than they could if they tried to do it alone. That doesn't mean that trade is always easy. That doesn't mean that trade benefits everybody equally. Some people lose their jobs, when we have a situation where we import goods from other countries instead of producing them here. But the story is that in the long run, potentially at least, trade is beneficial to each nation involved with that trade. So what we're going to do in this first episode is talk about that basic theory, the idea of why trade can potentially be very advantageous. In the second episode this week, and there'll be two episodes, we'll look at the arguments for why we might want to limit trade, what are called the protectionist arguments, and we'll look at some of the validity or invalidity of some of those arguments, along with the economics of the impact when we put on those trade barriers or those restrictions to free trade. And at the end of the second episode, we'll also talk a little bit about trends, what's been happening in terms of trade barriers, in recent years, and look a little bit at the existence of global trade agreements, global trade pacts like NAFTA and the European Union and some others. Okay, but for this week, our topic is to talk about the story of international trade and how it could at least potentially be beneficial to all of the parties involved. So let's look at our notes here and just make sure you've got some basic trade concepts down. I think most of you know this pretty clearly, but want to make sure. And that is, of course, there's a difference between imports and exports. Imports, of course, are goods or services that we purchase from other countries. So imports are goods or services purchased from other countries. So the idea is those goods or services were produced in those other countries originally, and then we import them, bring them into the United States, and purchase them here, instead of perhaps buying things that were produced here. So lots of examples of things that we import. I'm sure that if you guys looked at your collar of your clothing, you would see that it probably wasn't made in the United States, right? At least part of it was made outside of our country. Now, some of the basic items like cotton and all of that inputs used to make that clothing may have been grown here and then shipped off to China or Bangladesh or wherever, and then put together and assembled and then brought back into the United States. But a lot of that would be imported, right? Not produced in the United States, and we buy it. Or maybe you buy a bottle of French wine to romance your sweetheart, and the story is that that was made in France, not made in the United States. Or an imported car, or what have you, right? Lots of things that we import into the United States. Of course, we also sell a lot of products that we make here to other countries in the world, and those are our exports. So exports are goods or services that we sell to other countries. Goods or services that we sell to other nations. And so the story is there that not everything is made in China. There are things that we produce here and sell to other countries. There are also lots of services, of course, that we produce and sell to other nations as well. So exports are goods or services that we produce and then sell to other nations. So some examples here. One of our key exports, of course, is agricultural products. We sell lots of grain and lots of wheat and lots of foodstuffs, right? Agricultural products all over the globe, dairy products and cheese and all kinds of stuff. We also have been exporting a lot of energy in recent years, exporting a lot of propane and natural gas and those kinds of things, actually producing and drilling it here and then selling it to the rest of the world, not just consuming it ourselves. So exports are things that we make and sell to the rest of the world. Now, when we look at the two of these, right, the question that a lot of people sometimes focus on, perhaps too much sometimes, but the story is, what's the balance between exports and imports, right? Do we sell more to the rest of the world than we buy from them? Or is it the other way around, right? And so when we talk about the balance of trade, a nation is said to have a trade deficit, which sounds bad, but isn't necessarily all bad. A trade deficit, if it's the case that imports are greater than exports. So if we buy more from the rest of the world, we import more than we sell to the rest of the world, our exports, then our nation is said to have a deficit in trade, right, or a trade deficit. A trade surplus, of course, would just be the opposite. And so we have a surplus in trade if it's the case that we export more to the rest of the world than we import from them. So if we sell more to other nations than we buy from them, our nation is said to have a trade surplus. Now you look at those terms and they seem rather obvious that, hey, surplus is a good thing, deficit is necessarily a bad thing. And the answer is that's not necessarily the case. It depends, my favorite answer in all of economics. Specifically, for example, a trade deficit usually arises when we are able to afford lots of imports more than perhaps other nations are able to afford our exports. And so one reason that trade deficits really started to balloon in the United States after the late 1990s, or the beginning of the 1990s even, was the story that the US dollar became really, really, really strong. That's a great thing, right? A strong dollar. Hey, go America, buy American. But the story was that a strong dollar meant that our money went a long way. So imports from other countries were really cheap. Our dollar would buy a lot of products from China and Japan and other kinds of places because the dollar was really strong. And on the same token, the story is that our products, our exports, were really expensive to people in other parts of the world because the dollar was strong and their currencies were weak. And so part of the reason that we developed this was because in the 1990s we became really the world superpower. Soviet Union fell apart, symbolically at least in 1989 with the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And then 90 and 91, it really fell apart completely, and we didn't really have any global competition. Yes, the European Union has ascended, and now we have competition, and China is growing, we have competition. But part of the story here was just that the dollar was really strong. That is a problem long term, perhaps, if we have a perpetual trade deficit that gets huge, because it means that a lot of our dollars are flowing out of our country into other nations. And the question is, what are they doing over there, right? And sitting there, and there could be some long run costs if those dollars started to dump back on our shores, and that could be really problematic. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but the story is that, there's just an imbalance here, and the causes of it are interesting to think about. What you can do, and I encourage you and ask you to do this on the instructions on the Blackboard site, is to go to the PowerPoint handouts, the PowerPoint slides that are available that show you the most recent trade data when it comes to what the current situation is in terms of deficit or surplus last month, and what it's been over the course of the last year and the last few years. So please take a peek at those and make sure you get a sense of what the highlights are and the trends in recent years. So if you flip to page 2, the next question is, why should we trade? Right? So we got the language down, the basics, imports, exports, deficits, and surpluses. But why should we trade? Right? What's the benefits of trading? Why should we trade when, as it says on your sheet, we import lots of the things that we also export? We import a lot of agricultural products, and we export a lot of them too. We import oil, and we also export oil, right? We import propane, and we export propane. So the question is, why should we trade when we do that stuff? When we could produce many of the things that we import, so why do we trade? We could just produce it here. And why do we trade when we seem to be so worried about trade imbalances, right? It seems to get worrisome to a lot of people that we have a big trade deficit. So shouldn't we just stop trading and the problem would go away? And the moral of the story is, it goes back to week 1 of this class. That's about opportunity cost, because trade allows us, if you're filling in the blanks there, each nation to specialize. It allows each nation to specialize, and that increases total world output. I told you, I made a confession, early in week 1 here, that I'm not a self-sufficient human being. I don't do everything. I don't grow my own food, most of it. Some of it we do in our organic garden. I don't grow a lot of it though. And the story is I didn't make this video camera that I'm using to record this lecture or this whiteboard or this marker or this clothing that I'm using today. I didn't make the gasoline. I didn't even drill the oil and refine it into the gasoline that I use for my vehicle. I didn't make most of the things that I consume. What I do is I specialize and I teach economics. And then I trade with other people every day in this country and around the world to get the goods and services that they produce. And as a result, I'm better off, and so are they. Now, not everybody is better off in the short term because of that, but in the long run, the potential for benefit is enormous. Again, if you're looking at your sheet there, each country should specialize, if we're going global here, and produce the good that they produce at the relatively lowest cost. Not necessarily the absolutely lowest cost, but the relatively lowest cost. And that's because, if you think about it, you've got to produce one thing or the other with your labor hour. You can't produce both at the same time. Right? It'd be nice to be in two places at once. That'd be beautiful. Life would be maybe a little easier, perhaps. But the story is we can't. So we have to figure out when we produce something, where do we sacrifice the least of the other things? Where are we relatively the best or relatively not so bad? And that's where we should focus our energies and produce, produce, produce. Others should do the same and then trade. Because what happens then in bullet number 2 is that when a country engages in international trade, its consumption possibilities will always exceed its domestic production possibilities. Just like thinking about, on our little 6-acre farmette that my wife and my kids and I share, the story is that if I built a wall around our whole property and put a roof over it and let nothing in and nothing out, man, that'd be what I could produce, in Fortress Dunbar, and it wouldn't be good. My consumption possibilities would shrink dramatically. They'd only equal to what I could produce. But when I specialize and teach economics and then trade with others around me and tear down the wall, the story is that I can consume more than I could ever produce on my own, right? And so the story is that that is the potential benefit to trade. Now there are some caveats, as it mentions at the bottom here, and that is that although the potential pie could be bigger for all trading parties, not every individual within those nations will necessarily benefit. Some people that produce clothing in the United States, textiles, for example, don't produce clothing anymore because we're importing that from other nations. And those people's livelihoods and jobs are harmed in the short term. So we have to figure out a way to, retrain, reskill, retool those individuals to make it where they can produce things that are valued by people in the rest of the world. And that is painful. And I'm not, oblivious to that. I'm not downplaying the significance of that in any way, shape, or form. Those are real costs. And, we look at the news about, a company that's shutting down here and moving to another country, and we see those people who, have been cast into hardship perhaps, and we look at that and say, whoa, right, that could be me, and so we empathize with that, and rightfully so. We just have to figure out a way then, if we're going to rely on capitalism, to help those people get retrained, reskilled, and retooled. In addition, you can see some of the other aspects here that international trade sometimes ignores some of the other issues like depletion of non-renewable natural resources that may be really problematic for the future of our planet. You have to think about the story of human rights violations, environmental damages, etc. And that's part of the story. Plus, there are power differentials. So when we come to talking about trade negotiations, big country A and little country B, big country A might have a whole lot more power, and so they might have more power to dictate the terms of that trade in ways that benefit them a lot and benefit the small nation only a little bit because there's more to lose kind of story. And so in that sense, we have to talk about the power locus as well. So let's turn to page 3 and talk about the 2 key ideas here related to the potential benefits from trade. Before we do that, let me erase this board quick. And one of my favorite days of the year is in September, and it's International Talk Like a Pirate Day. Any pirates out there? So even though this is not the exact day what you're watching this, the story is we're going to tell a few pirate jokes today. At least I'm going to, and you can tell your own or send them to me on email. You know how to get me, right? R. Dunbar. Yeah, But the story is, for example, What do you call the distance from a center of a circle of pirates to the outside of a circle of pirates? R. I know. That's a math pirate joke. Here's one. How much does it cost a pirate to get his ears pierced? A buccaneer. No. What's Captain Hook's favorite store? A secondhand shop. R. No. Why do pirates not excel at team sports? Because there's no I in team. Was a pirate used to stop smoking? The patch. These aren't working for you? What can you do? Some other ones. Real quick. There was this pirate and he walks in this bar and he's got a paper towel on his head, right? And the bartender's seen everything in the many years bartending. And he pours the guy a drink, and after a while he says, "Do you realize you got a paper towel on your head?" And the pirate says, "Aye, there's a bounty on me head." You can't believe I'm telling these either. What else do I have here? I don't know. Is that it? No, I got a couple others. You guys know what branch of the military pirates belong to? How many of you said Army? That's not right. They're sailors. They belong to the Navy. So be careful in there, right? Be careful before you answer things. Take a break. Anyway, I'm going to stop and not telling you more pirate jokes, but they're kind of fun. What we are going to do is talk about the principles of absolute versus comparative advantage and what matters in terms of the potential benefit from trade. So let's start with the definition of absolute advantage. Absolute advantage means that you have the ability as a country to produce a specific good or service with fewer resources per unit of output than other countries. So fewer resources. In other words, if we're making beer, and this country, our country, can produce beer with fewer inputs than country B, then the story is we have an absolute advantage in making beer. It takes fewer resources per unit of beer to make that beer. So we have an absolute advantage. We're absolutely more productive, right? But when it says key there, absolute advantages in production don't mean anything. They do not matter when it comes to trade. They are irrelevant. They simply don't matter. Okay? So absolute advantage, easy for me to say, doesn't mean anything. What does matter is what we call comparative advantage. And what it refers to, if you look at the definition there, the ability of a country to produce a specific good or service at a lower opportunity cost, than its trading partners. Right? So the ability to produce a specific good or service at a lower opportunity cost than its trading partners. And it is comparative advantage that means everything when it comes to the decision to trade or not, to export or import. Comparative advantage is the relative opportunity cost. So let me tell you a couple of examples here. One is an historical one related to baseball, because I'm a big baseball fan. And the second was just a simple numeric example to how you do some of the calculations and see how to apply this concept. So just as a baseball story, back in the 19-teens and 1920s, there was this dude by the name of George Herman Babe Ruth. And Babe Ruth, when he first came up to the major leagues, when he came up from Baltimore in the International League up to the majors, which team did he play for? Yeah, he played for the Boston Red Sox, right? I don't know if you remember that, but he was a pitcher. In fact, he was a darn good left-handed pitcher for the Boston Red Sox. From 1915 to 1918, when he was with the Red Sox, he was a 20-plus game winner, right, each of those seasons. An awesome southpaw, left-handed pitcher. And the story was he pitched every 3-4 days or whatever for Harry Frazee, who was the owner of the Boston Red Sox and all of that. But the story was that there was a problem. Mr. Frazee, the theater man, was a theater producer. The owner of the Red Sox was a theater producer. And he had had a bunch of shows in a row that had lost a ton of money. So he was in desperation, right? And so what he ended up doing was selling the contract of the Babe Ruth, to the New York Yankees. That's where the old curse of the Bambino came from. Of course, the Red Sox have since won the World Series, but the argument was they wouldn't in the past because they sold Babe Ruth to the Yankees. But the situation is when Babe Ruth went to the New York Yankees, the New York Yankees had to make a decision about what to do with this guy, right? They could let him pitch every few days, right, in the rotation. The rotations were shorter back then. They usually pitched every 3 days or 4 days instead of 5. But the story was they could let him do that and figure he'd win 20, 21, 22, 23 games a year, right? Or they could have him play in the outfield, right, every single day. They could have him play and have that bat in the lineup every single day and let him hit and slug home runs. When it came to hitting home runs, nobody in that era did it like the Babe. Nobody was even close to Babe Ruth in terms of his ability to hit home runs. So the question is, what should the Yankees do? What did Miller Huggins, who was the manager, and Colonel Houston and Colonel Rupert, the owners of the Yankees, decide to do with Babe Ruth? Well, they decided to let him specialize and let him play every single day and put that bat in there and funk a bunch of home runs and not make him pitch. The story was that in absolute terms, absolute advantage, Babe Ruth was as good, if not better, than every other lefty in the league. So as a pitcher, he had an absolute advantage. He also had an absolute advantage when it came to slugging home runs, right? He was better at slugging home runs than anybody else in the league. But why do they have him specialize and have him, hit every single day? And the answer was because he had comparative advantage. He was so much better, right, when it came to, hitting home runs than anybody else in the league. And he was only just a little bit better when it came to pitching than other folks. So if they had him pitch and not hit, they would have given up a lot of home runs. If they had him hit and not pitch, they would have given up some wins. But there were other people that could have won a lot of games, right, for the Yankees. In fact, did back in those days. I mean, there were a lot of good pitchers for the Yankees. Got Waite Hoyt, Herb Pennock, Lefty Gomez, Bullet Joe Bush, Red Ruffing, Urban Shocker, whole bunch of guys. I mean, they had arms to beat them, and most of those guys are in the Hall of Fame. So the story is that, Babe Ruth had a comparative advantage with the stick. And so they put him in to do that every day, and the rest, as they say, is history. So special is that you can't be two places at once. Babe couldn't be pitching and hitting, consistently all the time, and it would have, doing both of them would have reduced his numbers on one or the other, and so they had him do specialization, which was hitting. So that's an example numerically, but let's look, historically, but let's look at an example when it comes to some simple numbers here. So just like we did in week 1, I'm going to assume that there's a world that only has 2 countries, country A and B. Creative, huh? And they only produce 2 things, beer or cheese. And in fact, I'm not going to call them A and B. I forgot. I'm going to call them North and South. Still really creative, don't you think? And so they only make 2 things, beer and cheese. And here's the production possibilities matrix. So you've already got this on your sheet. I'm just going to quickly put it up here. So we've got a situation where we have the North country shown in this column and the South's production possibility shown in this column. And first of all, we're going to look at how many units of beer they can produce per labor hour, right, for 1 hour of labor. And then the story is how much cheese could be produced per labor hour. And here are the numbers, right? So beer, cheese, North and South. In the North, with 1 hour of labor, they could produce 4 units of beer. Or with that unit of labor, they could produce 8 hours or 8 units of cheese. And in the South, with 1 hour of labor, they could produce 1 beer, or they could produce 4 units of cheese. Okay? So that's the production possibilities that we see if they do it alone. There's the North's possibilities, there's the South's possibilities. So my questions for you are below this. And the first one is, which nation has the absolute advantage in the production of beer? Which country is more productive with a labor hour at making beer? And the answer is the North, right? Because they can get 4, where the South could only get 1 with the labor hour. So filling in the blank there, the North has an absolute advantage in making beer. Who has an absolute advantage in making cheese, right? This bottom row. Yeah, the North, right? Because with a labor hour, they could make 8, and the South could only make 4 units of cheese. So the North is better at making cheese than the South. So the North has an absolute advantage in this example in both. And so then the question is, question 3, will the 2 countries ever trade with each other? And the first blush answer is no, but the right answer is yes, right? Why? Because if you're that labor hour, you can't be in 2 places at once. You can't be producing beer and cheese with each labor hour. You got to produce one or the other with that labor hour. And so there's an opportunity cost here, right? If we put resources into making beer, then we give up cheese, or vice versa. Same thing for the South, right? They can't be two places at once with those same resources. And absolute advantage, therefore, the North has the absolute advantage in both compared to the South, doesn't mean anything. It means nothing, right? It's irrelevant when it comes to potential benefits of trade. So then what we need to do is flip to the next page. I just want to make sure you see what absolute advantage looks like, but what I really want to talk about is comparative advantage, or relative opportunity cost differences. So take a look there at what you see on top of page 4. First question, question number 4, says which country has the comparative advantage in beer production? I'm going to let you fill in that blank in just a second, but let's look at the next ones here, right? Question, the bullet underneath says, what's the opportunity cost? What does the North give up when it produces one more beer? Well, if it produces 4 beer, that's equal to 8 cheese, right? 4 beer equals 8 cheese. So in the North, 1 beer, just divide both sides by 4, is going to cost them 2 cheese. Each beer they produce is going to cost the North 2 cheese. Okay? So 2 cheese. And then the question is, well, what about for the South? What if they make 1 more beer? Well, for the South, 1 beer, they use their labor hour there, means they can't use that labor hour to produce cheese, so they give up 4 cheese. So for the South, a beer is going to cost 4 cheese. That's their opportunity cost. And for the North, the beer is only going to cost 2 cheese. So who has absolute advantage in beer production? The North, right? As comparative, I think I said absolute. But the North has comparative advantage in beer production, right? Their opportunity cost is lower. So if you're filling in the blanks there, thus the North has the comparative advantage in beer production. And if you're going back up to question 4 at the very top, you could put North there as well, and we showed it with those numbers. Then for question 5, it says, well, all right, who has the comparative advantage when it comes to making cheese? And you might say, well, that's easy, right? It's going to be the South. And you're right, it is going to be the South, but let's prove it. So what is the opportunity cost to the North of producing 1 more cheese? Right? Well, again, remember that 4 beer equals 8 cheese in the North. So what's the equivalent for each cheese? We got to divide both sides by 8, and 4 over 8 is 1/2. So the opportunity cost to the North of making 1 more cheese is 1/2 of a beer. That's what they give up. What about in the South? What's the opportunity cost to the South of producing 1 more cheese? Well, since 1 beer equals 4 cheese, that's their trade-off. That means that each cheese, you got to divide both sides by 4, each cheese is worth 1/4 of a beer. So who's giving up the least if they produce an extra unit of cheese? Yeah, the South, right? South only gives up 1/4 of a beer for every cheese they produce, where the North would be giving up 1/2 of a beer. And so the story is that the South has a comparative advantage, right, when it comes to cheese, and the North when it comes to beer. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. The key is you can't use the resources both places at the same time, so we should specialize and then have each nation trade with each other. Have the North specialize and make beer, 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 and beer, and have this in this very simple example, and have the South specialize and make lots of queso, lots of cheese, right, and then trade with each other. And at the end, the North can have more beer and cheese than they could if they tried to just produce it themselves, right, with a wall around them and the lid on top and nothing in and out. And the same thing with the South. They could have more. Now, just real quick here, who's not going to like that in the North? If the North specializes and makes beer, 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 and beer. Yeah, the cheesemakers aren't going to be happy. They're going to be saying, wait a minute, time out, right? How dare you? You're taking away my jobs, right? You're shipping those cheese-making jobs to the South. I'm not happy about that. I've been doing this for generations. Protect me. And we're going to look at those arguments for protectionism in the next episode. But it's understandable that these people will be feel put out, right? That they will feel like they've lost their livelihood and their opportunities, and they will need to get retrained and reskilled and retooled. And that's not an easy process. Not an easy process at all. On the other hand, who's not going to like it in the South that they specialize and produce cheese, 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 and cheese? And the beer makers aren't going to be happy. We've been doing this for generations. How dare you take our jobs and ship them to the north, right? We're beer makers in the story as well. You know what? We're going to put those jobs somewhere else, and those folks are going to face a challenging time for a while, at least as they reskill and retool and all of that. And those are painful processes, really human challenges that are part of this potential advantage. This just says both countries can have a bigger party, more beer and cheese. Their consumption possibilities will be bigger than their domestic production possibilities, but doesn't talk about some of that challenge that other people face as that adjustment occurs. So the last topic for this episode, and then we'll have another episode in the rest of this week here, but the next topic on the next page is, okay, well, what will the terms of trade actually be? In other words, here's the opportunity cost. We calculated some of those. So the question is one of, well, what will the trades actually be? How many beer will have to be traded to get an extra unit of cheese, and vice versa? And that's what we call the terms of trade. Look at the definition there. It's the rate at which goods are actually exchanged, the amount of good X given up for good Y in trade. And look at the bullets. What determines those terms of trade? Well, the first thing is that a country, of course, won't trade unless its opportunities or its terms of trade are superior to its domestic opportunity costs. So they're not going to trade unless you're going to do better than you would if you're on your own. So they're not going to trade unless the terms are superior to their domestic opportunity costs. But they'd have to sacrifice if they just did it themselves. So they've got to make an improvement or they're not gaining, and obviously that's going to put the boundaries on, the parameters on this bargaining range. The terms are going to lie somewhere between, you're filling in the second blank there, the second part, somewhere between their respective domestic opportunity costs. What could we do on our own in country north, and what could country south do on their own? What are the trade-offs? Somewhere between those are going to be the area where they could come up with an agreement where they could both be made better off. And so if we look at that, the actual range is going to be determined by their bargaining power, which has to do with political stories, strength of will and personality and charisma of the negotiators, all kinds of other aspects, right, to this story. And we're not going to get into all of that in this class. Take an international trade class, which we do offer here at Madison College, and you'd have a chance to learn a little bit more about that. But the story is somewhere in that bound. So here, where are the terms of trade, right? Well, I gave you the answers there, that in the north, 1 beer is 2 cheese, right? We did that before. Remember 1 beer? If 4 beers are 8 cheese, 1 beer is equal to 2 cheese. And over in the south, 1 beer is equal to 4 cheese. So the terms of trade have to be between those two parameters. Between, if you're filling in the first blank, 1 beer equals 2 cheese. I'll trade you a beer for 2 cheese, and I'll trade you a beer for 4 cheese. It's got to be somewhere in the middle of those two, because those are the domestic opportunity costs, the domestic production possibilities in the rate of trade. If it's not between those two numbers, 1 to 2 and 1 to 4 in terms of beer to cheese, then neither nation will, or one of the nations at least, would say, no thank you, right? I can just do it on my own. I can do better here. And so trade would not occur. So that's the end of episode 26. In the next episode, we'll talk about the story of what are those calls for protection? Why might we want to limit trade? What are the pros and cons of doing that economically? And then we'll look at some recent trends and some international trade organizations like the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and some global trading pacts. So until then, have a great day.